Howdy everyone, welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. I was at the store the other day looking for some inspiration for the Wild Imaginary West, and I found some, in an unexpected place, and that was the aisle with the foam dart blasters. I was tempted to buy everything from the X-Shot lineup so that I could assemble this abomination, but decided that the motorized Rage Fire was intense enough as is. And the actual reason that I went with this bad boy is because I wanted to make a 1-to-1 scale Gatling gun for the Wild Imaginary West. I've made 2 life-size weapons so far, and I figured why not jump all the way to a rotary cannon. In the Wild Imaginary West, Gatling guns are expensive and rare, but they do exist, and most of the time they're placed on buildings, wagons, or mechs belonging to the people who can afford them. I'm going to be making some customizations that will prevent this thing from firing darts, so I decided to get at least 1 round of use in before I ruin it. With that done, it was time to disassemble. As I removed bits, I made sure to save them for later. I got rid of the scope and the top handle, and then I unscrewed all of the screws that held the body together. Once the body was open, I was able to remove the remaining pieces that I did not want, including all the plastic Picatinny rails, as I will not be adding any accessories to the side of this thing, and the grip at the back near the trigger. After that, I screwed the body back together, and in addition to patching up the new holes that I made, I will also be adding a crank that looks like it causes the barrels to rotate, a function that thankfully still works. This barrel is kind of funny in that it has some fake barrels that rotate around the orange barrel, which is the real barrel, so to make it look like the old school weapon, I'll be adding a central shaft and some support arms running down the sides. For the center support, I'll be using a cardboard roll with some tape for a nice snug fit, and then for the side rails, I'll be using some leftover pieces of a metal IKEA shelf. I traced the size of the tube onto a piece of acrylic, which I cut off camera, then drilled a hole in the center, and I glued the acrylic to the tube and stuck a small styrene tube in the hole, which I will be removing later. I used some pliers to bend the ends of those metal arms at a 90-degree angle so that the mounting holes would be on the same plane. The next step was to make a piece at the end of the rails which will connect everything together. I traced that out on a small wooden plank and I cut it on my bandsaw. After drilling some holes and testing the spinability, I put a new central rod in place as well as a cap nut, and then I screwed the whole assembly together. Because this is just for looks, it didn't have to be all that strong, so I wasn't too concerned about it being a little wobbly. I carefully drilled some holes on the side of the body, and then I screwed the rails in place, and it was time to move on to some other details. The next detail I added was a new fake magazine well for a top-mounted magazine. In order to encourage better adhesion, I flame-treated all of the plastic before gluing anything onto it. I sliced up all of the necessary styrene pieces and began filling in all of the holes left by the things that I had removed earlier. To make the magazine, I used some EVA foam strips. I cut 6 out to my desired length, and then I glued them all together, and it was the perfect size. I was able to reintegrate the old grip back into the build in 2 ways, the first being the handle of the crank. I took apart the handle and I cut off the old arm sections. I then heated a metal nut and pressed it into the end of the handle. I then reassembled all of the handle pieces, and I cut out a strip of acrylic that was the right dimensions for the crank arm. I drilled all the necessary holes before putting it all together. After drilling 1 more hole and mounting the handle to the side, I had a functional but non-functional hand crank for my Gatling gun. The next step was to patch up one side of the ammo belt receiver. Because of the magazine on the top, I only needed one side to be open to eject the shells. Once I had a nice flat surface to attach my little styrene wall, I glued some of those pieces back in place to give it some detail, and then I added some rhinestone rivets. I also patched up the sides of the magazine well, and I glued the magazine in place. I used one of those handle pieces that I had removed earlier. I glued it back on the top, and then I finally added the other half of the rear grip by itself near the trigger. Given that Gatling guns are so rare, I decided this one needed a bit of backstory. The town all pitched in to gift this to the sheriff after he risked his life to save them from a pack of prairie wolves. And when I say prairie wolves, don't think wolves, think prairie dogs. But wolves. With all of the construction done, it was time to paint. I took everything outside and I started with a layer of gunmetal, which I also applied to the tripod. Once that first layer of paint had dried, I masked off all of the sections that I wanted to stay that nice dark metal color. I took the rest outside and I gave it a coat of brass. After everything had been masked off and painted brass, including the tripod, I brought everything back inside. Once that had dried, I took off the masking tape and I revealed the results. Luckily, this was a pretty straightforward and simple painting process because I only had 2 colors to work with, and both of them were spray paint cans. But after the masking tape was off, I did do a little bit of weathering. And the first step in the weathering process was to apply a burnt umber oil wash. After diluting the paint with some mineral spirits, I carefully mixed that up and put it in my palette, and then I applied it to all of the brass surfaces generously. Once the brass was thoroughly washed, I dabbed it off with a paper towel, trying to leave it concentrated in the recesses and all the hard-to-reach areas. I also added some black panel liner to a few places to help push the contrast even further. I then cleaned up my workstation and encouraged the washes to dry a little faster using a hairdryer, and finally dabbed on some metallic pigment to give everything a subtle tarnished metal appearance. I didn't add any lights to this weapon, but in universe it has some built-in stabilization, and to represent that I added a couple wires. The last thing to do was to glue the star badge in place and do one final round of weathering with the airbrush. After going over all of the panel lines, the recesses, and outlining all of the details with a subtle dark wash, I called it good.
Come all you young rounders, and a story I'll tell of the promise of heaven and the warning of hell. Take heed where you ramble, or too soon you will go. Way up on the hillside where the new flowers grow. Well, he met in the springtime, the sun sinking low. 2 star-crossed lovers in the still melting snow, where the loving was easy and the courting was pretty.
That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Huge shout out to all of my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.